Good morning, everyone. This is Russell Rucker, and I'm here for another constitutional talk. And a few weeks ago we started our series on the Federalist Papers, and there is the other side too. There's the anti-Federalist Papers, and there's other things. So I want to talk today about a Federalist who was not a writer of the Federalist Papers. He was a member of the Constitutional Convention, however. And he became a Supreme Court justice in his own right. And on October 6th, in 1787, he made a speech explaining the Constitution. And we're in Pennsylvania instead of New York because the Federalist Papers are all about New York's ratification conventions. But here we're talking in Pennsylvania. What makes this interesting is this is a speech that was written. It was sent to all the different colonies, all the different states at that time, while they were working on their ratification convention. So it had more influence actually than the Federalist Papers did by landmass. Now, the Federalist Papers are important because we're trying to get New York to agree to adopt the Constitution. And this is important too. And this is the Supreme Court has used this a number of times to help explain originalist intent. And so that's where we're going to here. But I'm going to read this speech. It was very lengthy because one of the reasons was because of the applause that was given him at intervals throughout the speech in which he had to stop. But I'm going to read this for you and give you an idea of what James Wilson thought of our proposed Constitution. And it begins, Mr. Chairman and fellow citizens, having received the honor of an appointment to represent you in the late convention, it is perhaps my duty to comply with the request of many gentlemen whose characters and judgments I sincerely respect and who have urged that this would be a proper occasion to lay before you any information which will serve to explain and elucidate the principles and arrangements of the Constitution that has been submitted to the consideration of the United States. I confess that I am unprepared for so extensive and so important a disquisition, but the insidious attempts which are clandestinely and industriously made to pervert and destroy the new plan induce me the more readily to engage in its defense. And the impressions of 4 months' constant attention to that subject have been so easily efficiated as to leave me without an answer to the objections which have been raised. So he's talking about the 4 months that they spent in the convention and what is important here. And he's talking about the complaints from the ratifying conventions and complaints in newspapers of various individuals of, well, a stout reputations. And he continues, it will be proper, however, before I enter in this refutation of the charges that are alleged, to mark the leading discriminations between the state constitutions and the Constitution of the United States. When the people established the powers of legislation under their separate governments, they invested their representatives with every right and authority which they did not in explicit terms reserve. And therefore, upon every question respecting the jurisdiction of the House of Assembly, if the frame of government is silent, the jurisdiction is efficient and complete. But in delegating federal powers, another criterion was necessarily induced, and the congressional authority is to be collected not from tacit implication, but from the positive grant expressed in the instrument of union. Hence, it is evident that in the former case, everything which is not reserved is given. But in the latter, the reverse of the proposition prevails, and everything which is not given is reserved. This distinction, being recognized, will furnish an answer to those who think the omission of a Bill of Rights a defect in the proposed Constitution. For it would have been superfluous and absurd to have stipulated with a federal body of our own creation that we should enjoy those privileges of which we are not divested either by the intention or the act that has brought that body into existence. For instance, the liberty of the press, which has been a copious source of declamation and opposition that control can proceed from the federal government to shackle or destroy that sacred palladium of national freedom. If indeed a power similar to that which has been granted for the regulation of commerce had been granted to regulate literacy publications, it would have been as necessary to stipulate that the liberty of the press should be preserved inviolate, as that the impost should be general in its operation, with respect likewise to the particular district of 10 miles, which is to be made the seat of federal government. It will undoubtedly be proper to observe the salutary precaution, as there the legislative power will be exclusively lodged in the President, Senate, and House of Representatives of the United States. But this could not be an object with the convention, for it must naturally depend upon a future compact to which the citizens immediately interested will and ought to be the parties. And there is no reason to suspect that so popular privilege will be in that case be neglected. In truth, then, the proposed position no influence whatever upon the press, and it would have been merely nugatory to have introduced a formal declaration upon the subject, nay, that the very declaration might have been construed to imply that some degree of power was given, since we undertook to define its extent. Another objection that has been fabricated against the new Constitution is expressed in this disingenuous form. The trial by jury is abolished in civil cases. I must be excused, my fellow citizens, if upon this point I have taken of my professional experience to detect the futility of the assertion. Let it be remembered then that the business of the Federal Convention was not local, but general, not limited to the views and establishments of a single state, but coextensive with the continent and comprehending the views and establishments of the 13 independent sovereignties. When, therefore, the subject was in discussion, we were involved in difficulties which pressed on all sides, and no precedent could be discovered to direct our course. The cases open to a trial by jury differed in the different states. It was therefore impracticably on the ground to have made a general rule. The want of uniformity would have rendered any reference to the practice of the states idle and useless, and it could not, with any propriety, be said that the trial by jury shall be as heretofore, since there has never existed any federal system of jurisprudence to which the declaration could relate. Besides, it is not in all cases that a trial by jury be adopted in civil questions. For causes depending in courts of admiralty, such as relate to maritime captures, and such as are agitated in courts of equity, do not require the intervention of that tribunal. How then was the line of discrimination to be drawn? The convention found the task too difficult for them, and they left the business as it stands, in the fullest confidence that no danger could possibly ensue, since the procedures of the Supreme Court are to be regulated by the Congress, which is faithful representation of the people, and the oppression of government is effectually barred by declaring that in all criminal cases the trial by jury shall be preserved. The Constitution, it has been further urged, is of a pernicious tendency because it tolerates a standing army in a time of peace. This has always been a topic of popular declamation, and yet I do not know a nation in the world which has not found it necessary and useful to maintain the appearance of strength in a season of the most profound tranquility. Nor is it a novelty with us, for under the present Articles of Confederation, Congress certainly possesses this reprobated power, and the exercise of the power is proved at this moment by her cantonments along the banks of the Ohio. But what would be our national situation were it otherwise? Every principle of policy must be subverted, and the government must declare war before they are prepared to carry it on. Whatever may be the provocation, however important the object in view, and however necessary dispatch and secrecy may be, still the declaration must precede their preparation, and the enemy will be informed of your intention not only before you are equipped for an attack, but even before you are fortified for a defense. The consequence is too obvious to require any further delineation, and no man who regards the dignity and safety of his country can deny the necessity of a military force under the control and with the restrictions which the new Constitution provides. Perhaps there never was a charge made with less reasons than that which predicts the institution of a baneful aristocracy in the federal Senate. This body branches into two characters, the one legislative and the other executive. In its legislative character, it can effect no purpose without the cooperation of the House of Representatives. And in its executive character, it can accomplish no object without the concurrence of the president. Thus fettered, I do not know any act which the Senate can be itself perform, and such dependence necessarily precludes every idea of influence and superiority. But I will confess that in the organization of this body, a compromise between contending interests is discernible, and when we reflect how various are the laws, commerce, habits, population, and extent of the confederated states, the evidence of mutual concession and accommodation ought rather to command a generous applause and to excite jealousy and reproach. For my part, my admiration can only be equaled by my astonishment in beholding so perfect a system formed from such heterogeneous materials. The next accusation I shall consider is that which represents the federal Constitution as not only calculated, but designedly framed to reduce the state governments to mere corporations and eventually to annihilate them. Those who have employed the term corporation upon this occasion are not perhaps aware of its extent. In common practice, indeed, it is generally applied to petty associations for the ease and conveniency of a few individuals, but in its enlarged sense, it will comprehend the government of Pennsylvania, the existing Union of the States, and even these projected system is nothing more than a formal act of incorporation. But upon what pretense can it be alleged that it was designed to annihilate the state governments? For I will undertake to prove that upon their existence depends the existence of the federal plan. For this purpose, permit me to call your attention to the matter in which the President, Senate, and House of Representatives are proposed to be appointed. The president is to be chosen by electors, nominated in such manner as the legislature of each state may direct, as that if there is no legislature, there can be no electors. And consequently, the office of president cannot be supplied. The Senate is to be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature, and therefore, if there is no legislature, there can be no Senate. The House of Representatives is so to be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite of the electors of the most numerous branch of the state's legislature. Unless, therefore, there is a state legislature, that qualification cannot be ascertained. And the popular branch of the federal constitution must likewise be extinct. From this view, then, it is evidently absurd to suppose that the annihilation of the separate government will result from their union, so that having that intention, the author of the new system would have bound their connections with such indissoluble ties. Let me here advert to an arrangement highly advantageous, for you will perceive, without prejudice to the powers of the legislature in the election of senators, the people at large will acquire an additional privilege in returning members to the House of Representatives, whereas by the present confederation, it is the legislature alone that appoints the delegates to Congress. The power of direct taxation has likewise been treated as an improper delegation to the federal government. But when we consider it as a duty of that body to provide for the national safety, to support the dignity of the Union, and discharge the debts contracted upon the collective faith of the states for their common benefit, it must be acknowledged that those upon whom such important obligations are imposed ought in justice and in policy to possess every means requisite for a faithful performance of that trust. But why should we be alarmed with visionary evils? I will venture to predict that the great revenue of the United States must and always will be raised by imposts, for being at one less obnoxious and more productive, the interest of the government will be promoted by the accommodation of the people. Still, however, the objects of direct taxation should be within reach in all cases of emergency, and there is no more reason to apprehend oppression in the mode of collecting a revenue from this resource than in the form of an impost, which by universal assent is left to the authority of the federal government. In either case, the force of civil institutions will be adequate to the purpose, and the dread of military violence, which has been assiduously disseminated, must eventually prove the mere effusion of the wild imagination or of factious spirit. But the salutary consequences that must flow from this, enabling the government to receive the support and the credit of the Union, will afford another answer to the objections upon this ground. The state of Pennsylvania, particularly, which has encumbered itself with the assumptions of a great proportion of the public debt, will derive considerable relief and advantage for, as it was the impeccability of the present Confederation, which gave rise to the funding law. That law must naturally expire when a competent and energetic federal system shall be substituted. The state will then be discharged from an extraordinary brethren, and the national creditor will find it to be his interest to return to his original security. After all, my fellow citizens, it is neither extraordinary nor unexpected that the Constitution offered to us to your consideration should meet with opposition, it is the nature of man to pursue his own interests in preference to the public good, and I do not mean to make any personal reflection when I add that the interest of a very numerous, powerful, and respectable body to counteract and destroy the excellent work produced by the late convention. All the offices of government and all the appointments for the administration of justice and the collection of public revenue, which are transferred from the individual to the aggregate sovereignty of the states, will necessarily turn the stream of influence and emolument into a new channel. Every person, therefore, who either enjoys or expects to enjoy a place of profit under the present establishment will object to the proposed innovation. Not in truth because it is injurious to the liberties of his country, but because it affects his schemes of wealth and consequence. I will confess indeed that I am not a blind admirer of this plan of government, and that there are some parts of it which if my wish had prevailed, would certainly have been altered. But when I reflect how widely men differ in their opinions, and that every man, and the observation applies likewise to every state, has an equal pretension to assert his own, I am satisfied that anything nearer to perfection could not have been accomplished. If there are errors, it should be remembered the seeds of reformation are sown in the work itself, and the concurrence of 2/3 of the Congress may at any time introduce alterations and amendments, regarding it then in every point of view with a candid and distinguishable mind. I am bold to assert that it is the best form of government which has ever been offered to the world. Now he talks about amendments, about making changes if we aren't happy with what it is. He talks about it's his duty to discuss the Constitution. After all, he had worked on it. Now, keep in mind, Mr. Wilson does become Supreme Court Justice, so he has a seat at the table explaining how things are supposed to be laid out. He talks about the Senate being appointed by the legislative branch of the states. Obviously, this is outdated now because of a change, an amendment that came down allowing direct elections. But the whole idea that he's giving there is the importance of the legislatures in each state. Appointing electors, different things that they must do in order to even elect a president. So it shows the limitations of the federal government. And the principal point being is that anything that is not given to the federal government is reserved to the states. And that's why the Federalists did not believe the Bill of Rights was necessary, because they believed there was very little given to the federal governments and all else was reserved. And if you look at the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which is part of the Bill of Rights that was later approved, it even says in there that anything not given to the federal government nor reserved to it by the states becomes the rights of the states and the people. And that's really what we're talking about here, is the limited role of the federal government and what they agreed to do to set up a federal government. Yes, we gave up certain rights to have a federal government, to self-govern. We have to be able to self-govern. And I have had people tell me that the Constitution is not important. This is about real life, they say. Well, law is the rules we live by. And the rules we live by dictates real life. And the Constitution is the main law of the land, explaining those rights and duties of government. Because a government strong enough to help is strong enough to be tyrannical enough to hurt us. So there's an ebb and flow between the federal governments, the states, and the people. It's just a natural way of being. But this is the best liberty the world has ever seen. Most freedom, most liberty, and that's what makes our document so important. Like he says, he would have made changes if it was up to him. And virtually everyone from Ben Franklin on down, the last day, stated the same thing. That if it was up to them, they would have made changes. But you have a vast degree of differing opinions in a convention, and they have to hammer out the differences, which is why it took them 4 months to do so. This document, this speech I just read, was delivered to all the colonies, or a great majority of them anyway. And it's used today by the Supreme Court to discuss original interpretation on exactly what they believed the Constitution was. Now, when you look at the convention and you look at the feelings and beliefs that James Wilson just espoused here, it gives you an idea of what it really means, what it's supposed to mean, exactly why they did what they did. And that's why it's important to original intent and understanding. And original intent is important. It's not unintended consequences that are important. They should be removed. And the original idea of what was debated at the time is important. Because that's what we are arguing for and agreeing to when passed. Think about what Wilson says here about the separation of powers, about the importance of state legislatures, the importance of taxation, the idea that we cannot sit there and argue over a war and let our enemies see what we're preparing. There's a lot here in this speech. And there's a lot here to take in. If you take a few minutes and really think about what he's saying, it will give you a real good idea of how things are supposed to be. And with that, we'll catch you next week on the next Constitutional Talk. Have a good day for now, folks. We'll see you later next week. Bye for now.